The year was 1945. Across the vast lands of China, from the rice fields of the south to the dusty villages of the north, a fragile silence settled over a country that had endured years of endless suffering. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but the echoes of pain remained. For nearly 8 long years, China had fought a brutal war of survival against Japan's invasion. Entire cities had burned, families were torn apart, and famine had spread through villages like an invisible enemy. When victory finally came, the people of China hoped it would mean peace. But peace, as they would soon discover, was still a distant dream. In 1945, China was a wounded nation, exhausted, hungry, and divided. Fields once green were now graves. Roads were filled with refugees carrying little more than their memories and hopes. Millions had died. Millions more had lost everything they owned. The country had been fighting not just the Japanese invaders, but also its own poverty and chaos. Factories were destroyed, railways lay in ruins, the economy was shattered. And in this vacuum of despair, 2 powers stood facing each other, both claiming to hold the key to China's future. On one side stood the nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, a determined military leader who had ruled China since the 1920s under the banner of the Kuomintang, or KMT. Chiang dreamed of a united, modern China, one that could stand proud among the great powers of the world. He had received aid from Western countries, especially the United States, and many saw him as the man who could bring order to the chaos. But on the other side was a new force, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. Mao's followers were mostly peasants and poor farmers, men and women who had suffered under the weight of warlords and landlords for generations. They believed in a different kind of future, when land and wealth would be shared, and the common people would finally have a voice. To many in the countryside, Mao's red flag became a symbol of hope, a promise that life could change. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world celebrated. But in China, that victory opened a new question. Who would now rule this vast and broken land? The nationalists and communists had worked together during the war, a temporary alliance built on necessity, not trust. Now, with the common enemy gone, their deep differences resurfaced. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to reunify the country under the nationalist flag, restore government control, and rebuild China with the help of foreign allies. But Mao Zedong believed that real peace could only come when the old systems of oppression were destroyed, when the peasants themselves owned the land they worked on. For a brief moment, there was hope that the 2 sides could avoid another war. American diplomats tried to bring them together, urging them to form a coalition government. Meetings were held, smiles were exchanged, promises were made. But beneath those polite words, mistrust ran deep. Both sides were already preparing for the next battle, quietly gathering armies, securing supplies, and winning hearts across the villages and cities. For ordinary Chinese people, politics meant little compared to survival. In the countryside, families prayed for rain, food, and safety. In the cities, inflation made even rice and salt unaffordable. A day's wage could not buy a loaf of bread. Yet, amid this suffering, a quiet strength grew among the people. They had learned to endure, to rebuild, to hope even when hope seemed foolish. China's greatest resource was not gold, nor soldiers, nor weapons. It was the resilience of its people. This resilience would become the unseen force that carried the nation through its darkest years. The Communist Party knew that to win China, they would need more than guns. They would need the people's faith. And so, in the villages they controlled, they began small changes. Land reforms, schools for children, literacy classes for adults, and fair treatment for women. These were small acts, but they planted deep roots of loyalty. Peasants began to see Mao's revolution not as distant politics, but as a movement that touched their lives. The Nationalists, meanwhile, controlled the big cities, Nanjing, Shanghai, and others, but their government was burdened by corruption. Supplies sent to help the people often vanished before reaching them. Officials grew rich while the poor starved. The contrast between the two sides became clearer each day. One spoke of discipline, sacrifice, and equality. The other seemed to represent the old order, power, privilege, and distance from the common man. By late 1945 and 1946, skirmishes between the two forces had already begun. What started as small clashes soon grew into full battles. Trains carrying supplies were attacked, villages were seized, and both sides blamed the other for breaking the peace. In truth, the peace had never truly existed. China was simply catching its breath before plunging back into war. The Civil War was no longer a question of if, it was now a matter of when. Mao Zedong understood that the Communists could not defeat the Nationalists in open battle, not yet. The Nationalists had far more soldiers, airplanes, and weapons, but Mao believed time itself was his greatest weapon. He told his followers that the revolution was not a race, but a journey. They would fight slowly, patiently, winning village by village, heart by heart. And when the time was right, they would rise together like a storm. This belief, that power grows from the people, became the core of Mao's revolution. Chiang Kai-shek faced an impossible task. He wanted to rebuild China's cities, maintain order, and crush the communists, all at once. But his army was tired and his government was deeply unpopular. Foreign aid helped, but it also made many Chinese feel that Chiang was too dependent on outsiders. Meanwhile, his officers grew frustrated and morale dropped. Each victory seemed smaller, each defeat more costly. Chiang was a man torn between his dreams of greatness and the realities of his nation's weakness. Throughout 1945 and 1946, China stood on the edge of transformation. To many peasants, the communist message of equality and land reform felt like justice after centuries of exploitation. To businessmen and intellectuals in the cities, the Nationalists still represented the promise of modernity and global respect. China's destiny balanced on a knife's edge. But beneath that uncertainty, a quiet revolution was already unfolding, not yet on the battlefield, but in the minds of millions who were beginning to believe that change was possible. As this chapter closes, one truth stands out. China's revolution did not begin with weapons, but with will. The will of a people who had endured too much for too long. The will of a nation that refused to remain broken. Every storm begins with a whisper, and in 1945, across the fields and mountains of China, that whisper was growing louder, a whisper that said, "A new dawn is coming." China in 1946 was a land searching for direction. The war against Japan had ended, but the struggle for China's soul had only begun. Two leaders, two armies, and two very different dreams stood face to face, each claiming to hold the true path forward. The Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek promised order, unity, and modernization. The Communists under Mao Zedong promised equality, justice, and power to the people. Between them lay a wounded nation, divided by class, by geography, and by pain. Chiang Kai-shek was a soldier, molded by discipline and ambition. He believed in strength, authority, and hierarchy. To him, the revolution was chaos. What China needed, he thought, was control, a firm hand to restore law and rebuild what the wars had destroyed. Chiang's China would be one of industry, progress, and international respect. He envisioned highways, factories, and modern cities rising from the ashes. But his vision came from the top down. He wanted to guide the people, not be guided by them. Mao Zedong's dream was born from the soil itself, from the peasants who worked it, and from the hunger that had haunted them for centuries. He was not a general in a starched uniform, but a revolutionary who lived among his followers, sharing their food and sleeping in their huts. Mao's China would rise from the bottom up. He believed the strength of a nation came not from its rulers, but from its people. The people are like water, he would later say, and the army is the fish that swims in it. To him, the revolution was not just about power, it was about giving life to the millions who had always been forgotten. The world around them was watching. The United States stood behind Chiang Kai-shek, providing money, supplies, and weapons, hoping he would build a democratic, capitalist China to counter the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, quietly supported Mao's forces in the north, supplying captured Japanese weapons and training. In many ways, China was becoming the first great stage of the Cold War, a silent contest between two superpowers fought through the fate of one nation. But for the Chinese people, this was not a battle of ideologies. It was a fight for food, land, and dignity. In the countryside, the communist message spread like fire. Their land reform policies gave peasants ownership of the fields they worked on. It was the first time in living memory that farmers felt they truly had a stake in their future. In villages, people gathered to hear speeches about equality and freedom from exploitation. They did not know what communism meant, but they knew what it felt like to be hungry and what it meant to be heard. In the cities, the story was different. Merchants, intellectuals, and officers still looked to the nationalists as the legitimate government. They feared the chaos that the revolution might bring. They wanted stability more than change. To them, Chiang represented order, and order meant survival. But as months passed, cracks began to appear. Inflation soared, corruption spread, and frustration grew among those who had once believed in the nationalists' promise. By mid-1946, the truce between the two sides had collapsed completely. Fighting broke out in the northern provinces, and soon the flames of civil war spread across the country. The nationalists launched a major offensive, determined to crush the communist strongholds in the countryside. With American planes and superior weapons, they pushed deep into the northern plains. For a moment, it seemed as if Chiang's forces might succeed. But Mao had no intention of meeting the nationalists in open battle. He believed in patience and strategy, not haste. His soldiers melted into the hills and forests, striking from the shadows, disrupting supply lines, and retreating before the enemy could strike back. To outside observers, it looked like the communists were running, but Mao called it strategic retreat. He knew that victory would come not from strength alone, but from endurance. While the nationalist forces spread thin across the countryside, the communists regrouped, rebuilt, and waited for their moment. The real battle was not for land, but for loyalty. And in that battle, Mao's forces were slowly winning. By late 1946, the war had turned into a contest of hearts and patience. The nationalists held the cities, railways, and ports, but they were losing the countryside, the soul of China. In the villages, communist cadres organized land redistribution meetings, where farmers were given plots that had once belonged to absentee landlords. These gatherings were simple but powerful. Peasants cheered, cried, and pledged loyalty to the new cause. For them, this was more than politics, it was justice. The nationalists, meanwhile, faced growing unrest in the areas they controlled. Inflation reached unbearable levels. Prices doubled every few weeks. A bag of rice cost more than a month's salary. Soldiers went unpaid. Civilians lost faith. Reports of corruption and abuse by government officials spread quickly, and every scandal fed the communist message that the old order was rotten. Chiang Kai-shek tried to hold his government together through force and discipline, but the harder he pressed, the more the people resisted. His officers began to lose morale. Some defected. Others grew careless. The war that had started with confidence was now dragging into frustration. Mao Zedong's strategy of people's war was working. His troops fought not for pay but for belief. They lived off the land, shared food with villagers, and treated civilians as comrades rather than subjects. Propaganda plays, songs, and speeches spread the dream of a new China where peasants and workers would be equal. The revolution was not just being fought, it was being felt. As the months turned into years, the contrast between the two sides became clearer. The nationalists relied on weapons, but the communists relied on will. Chiang had tanks, but Mao had time. The nationalists ruled through authority. The communists ruled through conviction. The Civil War was no longer just a military struggle, it had become a moral one. For the people, each passing season tested their endurance. Many villages changed hands several times, suffering raids and reprisals from both sides. Fields lay barren, and hunger returned. But even in that darkness, hope began to shift. Peasants whispered that the revolution might finally bring change. Young men left their homes to join Mao's army, believing that their fight would give meaning to generations of suffering. By the end of 1947, the tide of belief was turning. The nationalists still had more soldiers, but fewer supporters. The communists still had fewer weapons, but more hearts. As the historian would later write, Chiang Kai-shek lost China not because he was weak, but because he was alone. Mao Zedong won China not because he was strong, but because he was not alone. In this struggle between two visions, one dreamed of order, the other of equality. One sought to rebuild from above, the other from below. Both wanted to save China, but only one understood that a nation is not built on walls or weapons, but on the faith of its people. And in those years between 1946 and 1947, that faith began to shift like a quiet river changing its course, slowly, steadily, and forever. History often shows that the greatest revolutions do not begin with anger, but with longing. The longing to live with dignity, to work with fairness, and to be seen as human. The Chinese Communist Revolution began with such longing. It was not just a war for power, but for meaning. And as China's two visions clashed, it became clear that the fate of the nation would not be decided by generals or governments alone, but by the millions who tilled the land, carried their burdens, and dared to hope that someday their suffering would not be in vain. China was burning again. The Second World War had ended, but peace had not returned to its lands. The Japanese army had left, but behind them they left chaos, shattered villages, looted towns, hungry people, and two powerful armies staring at each other once more. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, stood for the old republic, backed by the West. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, promised a new China, one built by peasants and workers. At first, it seemed the nationalists had the upper hand. They controlled most of the big cities, Nanjing, Shanghai, and much of the railways. They had tanks, airplanes, and foreign support. The communists were still mostly in the countryside, in the hills and mountains of northern China. Their weapons were simple. Their soldiers wore worn-out shoes, but their spirit was unbroken. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the two sides tried to talk. There were meetings, letters, and even smiles for the cameras. American diplomats hoped to bring peace. But deep down, both sides knew the truth. China was too divided to share one power. Neither Chiang nor Mao would step aside. The peace talks failed. Soon, gunfire once again echoed through the valleys. The Chinese Civil War, which had paused during the fight against Japan, started again, fiercer than ever. Mao Zedong had learned many lessons during the long struggle. He knew the strength of the peasants. He knew that winning hearts was more powerful than winning cities. So instead of rushing to attack, he told his men to stay patient. The countryside, he often said, surrounds the cities. It meant that victory would begin with the people, not the palaces. The communists began to rebuild what they called liberated areas. These were the villages under their control. Here, life started to change. Landowners who had long held power were asked to share or give up their extra land. Poor farmers who had always bowed their heads were now given small plots of their own. People could join local committees, speak up, and take part in decision-making. It wasn't always peaceful or perfect. There were mistakes and sometimes violence. But for many ordinary Chinese, it was the first time they felt that their lives mattered. Meanwhile, in the cities, things were not going well for the nationalists. The long years of war had drained the economy. Inflation rose to unbearable levels. A bag of rice could cost a family's entire savings by evening. Corruption spread through the government. Officials grew rich while citizens starved. Many people began to lose faith in Chiang's rule. They still feared the communists' ideas, but they also saw that the nationalists were failing to deliver hope. In the mountains of the northeast, Mao's commanders, especially Lin Biao, began organizing disciplined, effective troops. They fought smartly, avoiding big losses. They cut off enemy supplies, attacked suddenly, then disappeared into the hills. Slowly, inch by inch, they began to win back ground. The year 1947 became a turning point. The nationalists launched major attacks to crush the communist bases. They had larger armies and better weapons, but they faced a new kind of enemy, one that melted away when attacked and appeared again when least expected. In many areas, the villagers themselves acted as lookouts, guiding the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, through forests and rivers. The war was no longer just between two armies. It had become a war of people versus power. That same year, Mao and his team moved their headquarters from the caves of Yan'an into the open plains. It was risky, but it showed confidence. Mao told his followers that the time had come to go on the offensive. The people, he said, are the real heroes. And indeed they were. By 1948, the balance of power began to shift dramatically. The communists were no longer just rebels hiding in villages. They had built a strong, organized army. They had learned from their defeats, and their commanders were bold but careful. Every victory brought them more soldiers, as captured nationalist troops often joined their ranks. 3 massive campaigns would soon decide China's fate: the Liaoshen, Huaihai, and Pingjin campaigns. Together, they would seal the destiny of the revolution. The Liaoshen campaign took place in the northeast, where the communists sought to control Manchuria. This region was rich in industry, and whoever controlled it would have the resources to win the war. Lin Biao led the communist forces there. For months, they surrounded nationalist cities, cutting off roads and supplies. Chiang's troops fought hard but were stretched thin. When the city of Jinzhou fell, it was a crushing blow. The nationalist army in the northeast collapsed. The communists now had factories, railways, and weapons, everything they once lacked. Next came the Huaihai campaign in central China, one of the largest battles in Chinese history. More than 500,000 men fought in the plains between the Huai and Yellow rivers. The communists didn't have superior weapons, but they had the people. Farmers carried supplies on their backs, pushed carts of grain, and repaired roads under enemy fire. It was said that the people moved mountains during Huaihai. The nationalist troops, though brave, were cut off, confused, and short on food. After months of fighting, they surrendered. Nearly half of Chiang's best army was lost. Finally, the Pingjin campaign targeted the north, Beijing, Tianjin, and nearby areas. By now, morale among nationalist troops was low. They were tired and uncertain about their cause. Many officers began to surrender or switch sides. The communists entered Beijing almost peacefully in early 1949. The ancient capital, once ruled by emperors, now belonged to a new force, the People's Liberation Army. As each victory strengthened Mao's vision of a united China, Mao often reminded his followers that victory should not bring arrogance. He said, "The people's trust is harder to keep than to win." He feared that the revolution might lose its purpose if leaders forgot humility. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek grew increasingly isolated. His advisors argued, his generals lost confidence, and his allies in the West began to doubt he could win. In December 1948, Chiang resigned from his position as president of the Republic of China, though he remained the real power behind the government. He hoped to regroup and fight again, but time was running out. By the spring of 1949, communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, the last great barrier between North and South. City after city opened its gates. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in April without much resistance. Shanghai followed soon after, and Guangzhou not long later. The red flag of the revolution now waved over much of China. It was not just a military victory, it was a transformation of belief, from despair to hope, from division to unity. After years of war, millions longed for peace and order, and Mao promised both under a new government of the people. But beneath the celebrations, there was also silence, the silence of a wounded land. Countless families had lost loved ones. Farmlands were burned, and cities lay in ruins. Yet amid that pain, there was also a shared feeling that China had finally taken its destiny into its own hands. In the coming months, Mao would prepare to announce something the world had never seen before, the birth of a new China, under a new name, new flag, and new dream. And as one chapter of history closed, another, full of promise and uncertainty, was about to begin. It was the morning of October 1, 1949. A soft autumn sun shone over Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The air was filled with excitement, relief, and disbelief. After so many years of war and suffering, the guns had finally gone silent. From the balcony of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, a tall figure in a simple gray suit stepped forward. His voice was calm, yet full of power. Mao Zedong declared, "The Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China is established." And with those words, history turned a page. All around the square, thousands of people cheered. Red flags waved in the air. Farmers, workers, students, and soldiers cried tears of joy. They had seen warlords, emperors, invaders, and dictators come and go, but now they believed China had truly become theirs. For Mao and his comrades, this was the victory of a lifetime. The revolution that began in the mountains and villages had reached its destination, the capital. But even on that bright morning, Mao knew this was only the beginning. The hardest task still lay ahead, to rebuild a country that had been torn apart for decades. China in 1949 was broken. Cities were ruined, bridges destroyed, and millions of people had no homes. Farmland was dry and abandoned. Industries had stopped. Trains didn't run. Many children could not read or write. It was as if the nation had to start from zero. Yet the mood among the people was hopeful. After generations of division, they finally felt united. The dream of a new China was not just Mao's dream, it was shared by millions who had suffered and survived. Mao and the Communist Party moved quickly to bring order. The new government's first goal was peace. Armies were told to maintain discipline, no looting, no mistreatment of civilians. In many cities, communist soldiers helped clean streets, rebuild schools, and open hospitals. This won the hearts of people who had grown tired of warlords and corruption. The next big challenge was land reform. In the countryside, Mao's promise to the peasants had been clear. Land would belong to those who worked it. So the government began to redistribute land from rich landlords to poor farmers. It was a bold and emotional process. For centuries, land had been the source of both wealth and power. Now, for the first time, poor families could plant on their own soil, free from debt or rent. But this reform also came with pain. Some landowners resisted. In many places, old feuds reappeared. Local anger sometimes turned into violence. The government tried to control it, but in such a vast country, not everything went as planned. Still, for most peasants, it was a revolution not just of politics, but of life itself. They could finally dream of feeding their children, building homes, and shaping their own futures. In the cities, Mao's team focused on restarting the economy. They reopened factories, fixed railways, and tried to control prices. Inflation slowly came under control. The government also began large public campaigns, encouraging cleanliness, literacy, and equality between men and women. Posters filled the walls with simple slogans: "Work hard, build the nation," and "Serve the people." At the same time, Mao worked to strengthen the party's organization. Every official was reminded that they were servants of the people. The party sent cadres, trained leaders, to every province, town, and village. Their task was to listen, organize, and guide. It was not always easy. The country was huge and communication was slow. Some areas were still recovering from war. Yet step by step, China began to stand on its feet again. Beyond its borders, the world watched closely. Many countries were surprised, and some were worried. The rise of Communist China came at a time when the world was dividing into two sides: the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun, and Mao's victory gave new strength to socialism in Asia. At first, Mao sought friendship with the Soviet Union. He believed both nations shared the same dream: equality, independence, and development. In 1950, Mao even traveled to Moscow to meet Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. The meeting was not easy. Stalin treated Mao cautiously, but eventually, both countries signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. The Soviet Union agreed to provide loans, technology, and experts to help China rebuild. For many Chinese, this was a sign that their country was finally recognized as a powerful, independent nation. While Mao and his government worked to rebuild China, Chiang Kai-shek and the remaining nationalist forces fled southward. They retreated first to Guangdong, then to the island of Taiwan, carrying with them gold, documents, and soldiers. From there, Chiang vowed to return one day and reclaim the mainland. But for now, two Chinas existed. One, the People's Republic of China under Mao; the other, the Republic of China under Chiang. This division would shape Asian politics for decades. On the mainland, the early years of the new government were full of hope and challenges. Mao believed that to make China strong, people must work together as one family. He encouraged citizens to join neighborhood committees and cooperatives. People learned to read using new simplified Chinese characters. Farmers were taught new methods of growing rice and wheat. It was a time of rebuilding, of trying, of dreaming. But change never comes without struggle. Some people were unsure about the communist system. Wealthy merchants feared losing their businesses. Religious leaders worried about their freedom. And old habits, corruption, favoritism, inequality, still existed in many places. Mao's government responded with what were called campaigns. These were nationwide movements meant to clean up society against corruption, waste, and bureaucracy. Posters, radio broadcasts, and public meetings reminded people that China's strength depended on honesty and discipline. At the same time, education and women's rights took center stage. Mao believed that women hold up half the sky. Schools opened their doors to girls. Women could own land, work, and choose whom to marry. These were enormous changes in the society that had long treated women as second-class citizens. Families began to change too. Young people spoke of building a new world, not living by old rules. It was a revolution of hearts as much as politics. In the countryside, land reform continued, and the first cooperatives appeared. Instead of farming alone, families pooled tools, animals, and effort. It was the beginning of collective farming, though still voluntary at this stage. The idea was simple: together, we can achieve more. By 1950, China also found itself drawn into its first international conflict, the Korean War. When war broke out between North and South Korea, Mao decided to send Chinese troops to help the North, which was supported by the Soviet Union. It was a difficult decision, as China was still weak and recovering. But Mao believed that protecting socialism in Asia was worth the risk. The war was fierce and costly. Many Chinese soldiers, known as the People's Volunteers, fought bravely in freezing mountains, far from home. When the war ended in 1953, China's losses were heavy, but its pride was great. The world had learned that the new China would not be bullied or ignored. Back home, the government used the war as a symbol of unity and sacrifice. Posters showed brave soldiers side by side with farmers and workers. The message was clear: every citizen had a role in defending and rebuilding the nation. In the following years, China's economy began to grow. Soviet engineers helped build steel plants, power stations, and railways. Education expanded. Cities buzzed with new activity. There were parades, songs, and films praising progress. The red flag of the People's Republic flew proudly from every school and government building. Still, Mao often reminded his people that revolution was not just about fighting enemies. It was about changing minds. "Serve the people," he said again and again. "Work for the good of all, not for yourself." And that became the moral heart of the early People's Republic, a belief that sacrifice and service were the foundation of a better nation. But beneath the surface, challenges remained. Some parts of the country still suffered from poverty and hunger. Industrial development was uneven. And within the party itself, there were debates about how fast China should change, whether to follow the Soviet model or to find its own way. These questions would shape Mao's next steps that would lead to great ambition, great hope, and great trials. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, China stood at a crossroads. The dream of unity had been achieved, but the dream of prosperity was still far away. Mao looked out across the vast land, from the deserts of the West to the rivers of the East, and believed that the revolution was not yet complete. It had only entered a new stage. A nation that had once been torn apart was now under one flag. A people who had known nothing but war were learning peace. And a leader who had walked barefoot through the mountains was now guiding a quarter of the world's population into a new age. The road ahead would not be easy, but for that moment, in the early years of the People's Republic, China truly believed, that it could rise again. When the dust of revolution finally settled, China faced a new kind of battle, not one of bullets, but of rebuilding. The dream that had united millions now had to be turned into daily reality. And that, Mao Zedong knew, was harder than winning any war. The early 1950s were a time of determination and discipline. The new China was like a young tree, full of potential, but needing care, protection, and patience to grow. Mao often said that victory was only the first step. True success would come when the people could live with dignity, education, and food on their tables. The first task was stability. After years of chaos, the government had to bring order to every corner of the land. Soldiers and volunteers helped rebuild roads and bridges. Old war zones were cleared, and refugees returned to their villages. Officials were instructed to live simply and serve honestly. Across the nation, posters carried Mao's words, "The people and the people alone are the driving force in the making of world history." In many ways, this was the most peaceful moment China had known in generations. People began planting crops again. Children went back to school. Trains ran across provinces that had once been divided by front lines. Slowly, a sense of nationhood began to take root. But peace alone wasn't enough. Mao and the Communist Party wanted transformation, a China free from poverty and inequality. The question was, how? Mao believed that the revolution must continue, not through violence, but through social reform. The party launched campaigns to end old customs, eliminate corruption, and educate the people. One of the first was the marriage law of 1950. For centuries, many women in China had been denied choice. They were often forced into arranged marriages, sometimes bought or sold as wives. Now the new law declared that marriage must be voluntary, equal, and based on love. Divorce was also legalized. The law shocked many traditional families, but it gave women new freedom and dignity. In schools, children learned to read and write using new textbooks that spoke about equality and citizenship. In towns, workers joined unions to protect their rights. And in villages, land reform continued, breaking centuries-old hierarchies. Yet Mao also understood that unity required strong control. China was vast, and not everyone supported the communist system. Some old warlords still held influence. Others secretly opposed the party. To strengthen loyalty, Mao launched campaigns known as the 3 Anti and 5 Anti movements. The 3 Anti targeted corruption, waste, and bureaucracy within the government. The 5 Anti focused on tax evasion, bribery, and fraud among businessmen. These campaigns called on citizens to report dishonesty wherever they saw it. It was both a moral and political movement, teaching people to live cleanly, but also warning them that the revolution demanded purity and discipline. Some saw these campaigns as necessary. Others feared them. There were public meetings, confessions, and even punishments. But they also created a new culture of accountability. People began to believe that the new China would not tolerate greed or deceit. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the government faced a massive task: feeding the people. China's population was growing rapidly, but its farms were still small and primitive. The party encouraged peasants to work together. Mutual aid teams and cooperatives were formed, where families shared tools, animals, and seeds. Productivity began to rise, though progress was uneven. In the cities, factories reopened with help from the Soviet Union. Engineers from Moscow trained Chinese workers in new industries: steel, coal, and machinery. Slowly, China's economy began to recover. But Mao was cautious. He didn't want China to depend too much on foreign help, even from allies. He often reminded his people that self-reliance was the true foundation of strength. He said, "The East is rising. China must stand on its own feet." Still, Mao's greatest challenge was not economic. It was emotional. After years of war, many people were tired, uncertain, and afraid of change. Some clung to old traditions. Others resisted the party's strict rules. Mao tried to inspire them with what he called the spirit of the masses. He wanted everyone, worker or farmer, teacher or soldier, to feel part of one great family. Through newspapers, radio, and public gatherings, Mao's image became the face of this new spirit. He was portrayed as a wise teacher, a patient father of the nation. People sang songs about him, displayed his quotes, and even kept his picture in their homes. For millions who had grown up in suffering, Mao represented hope. But with hope came power, and with power came risk. Some within the party began to worry that Mao's influence was becoming too great. They respected his leadership, but feared personal loyalty might replace honest discussion. Mao, however, dismissed such fears. He believed that unity under firm guidance was essential to avoid chaos. In his speeches, he often reminded officials that revolution is not a dinner party. It was not about comfort or compromise. It was about struggle, discipline, and faith. By 1952, China began to look different. Cities that once lay in ruins now buzzed with life. New bridges spanned rivers. Streetlights glowed in the night. Children marched in schools, singing revolutionary songs. The sense of national pride was growing. People believed that after centuries of humiliation, their country was finally rising again. But beneath the surface, new tensions were forming. The government's campaigns against corruption and greed had cleansed many parts of society, yet they also created fear. Some business owners closed shops, worried about being accused of disloyalty. Bureaucrats hesitated to make decisions, afraid of mistakes. It was a time of both excitement and caution, a nation learning to balance freedom and control. Mao's leadership was firm but idealistic. He often said that China must learn from the Soviet Union, but not copy it blindly. He admired their industrial power, but wanted a path that suited China's unique culture and people. So, the government introduced the first 5-year plan, a national project to rebuild and modernize China. It focused on heavy industries, power plants, and railways. The plan aimed to turn China from an agricultural nation into an industrial one. The slogan was simple: work hard and build socialism. To support this plan, the party encouraged literacy campaigns and technical training. Scientists and engineers were celebrated as heroes. Workers were taught that every hammer strike and every shovel of coal contributed to the nation's rise. The message was clear: this was everyone's revolution. But Mao also knew that numbers and machines alone couldn't define success. He wanted the revolution to shape the human heart, to build a new kind of citizen. Serve the people was not just a phrase, it was a way of life. Soldiers helped farmers harvest crops. Students taught villagers how to read. Doctors traveled to remote areas, offering care to those who had never seen a hospital. It was a time when small acts of kindness were seen as revolutionary deeds. Yet as the country moved forward, some began to question how much control the party should have over individual lives. Could people speak freely? Could artists and writers express their own ideas? These questions would later become central to China's story. But for now, most people focused on survival, work, and hope. The early 1950s also brought moral lessons that echoed through every street and village. The government emphasized honesty, simplicity, and collective good. Luxury was discouraged. Wasting food was considered shameful. Citizens were told to think not just about themselves, but about the millions who shared their struggles. Mao often spoke of unity and humility. "A single spark," he once said, "can start a prairie fire." He meant that even small actions, honesty at work, fairness in trade, kindness to neighbors, could change the world. And that message spread far beyond politics. It became a moral guide for a generation raised on the belief that they were building not only a new nation, but a new humanity. By 1953, China's transformation was visible to all. The economy was improving, schools were full, the army was strong. And for the first time in modern history, the Chinese people felt secure within their own borders. But Mao was restless. He saw progress, yet he feared complacency. He believed that revolutions die when people grow comfortable. He began to wonder, had the spirit of struggle faded too soon? Those thoughts would soon shape his next great vision, one that would test the nation's strength, faith, and unity like never before. But for now, China stood proud and hopeful. The red flag flew high above every city. The songs of labor echoed in the air. And in the hearts of millions, one belief burned bright, that after centuries of darkness, they had finally found their light. By the mid-1950s, China had been transformed. The years of war, uncertainty, and struggle had given way to a new order, a new flag, and a new hope. The Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had not only won the Civil War, but had also created a nation that looked toward the future. Mao's victory was more than a military triumph. It was a victory of ideas, of vision, and of human perseverance. For decades, China had been divided, ruled by warlords, weakened by foreign invasion, and haunted by poverty. Now, under the banner of the People's Republic, the nation stood united for the first time in centuries. The legacy of this revolution can be seen in every corner of China. The countryside, once ruled by landlords, had new systems of land ownership. Farmers could finally see the results of their labor. In the cities, industry was slowly recovering, schools opened their doors to all children, and health services reached places that never had doctors. Yet Mao's greatest impact was not only in buildings or laws, it was in the hearts and minds of the people. After years of oppression, many Chinese citizens finally believed in their own power. They learned that change is possible when ordinary people stand together, speak together, and work together. Mao's philosophy was simple but profound. He often said, "The people and the people alone are the motive force in the making of world history." This was not just a statement about politics, it was a moral lesson. It reminded citizens that true strength lies in unity, courage, and collective effort. The early reforms also left a lesson about responsibility. Leadership was no longer about privilege or wealth. Officials were expected to live simply, serve honestly, and put the people first. Bribery, laziness, and corruption were seen as threats to the nation's progress. In villages, towns, and cities, people learned that society thrives only when each person acts with integrity and care for others. The revolution also taught a lesson about resilience. Millions of Chinese had endured decades of war, famine, and invasion. They had witnessed their homes destroyed, families lost, and hopes crushed. Yet they continued to rise, rebuild, and believe. The revolution showed that even in the darkest times, perseverance, discipline, and faith in a common cause can transform a nation. Mao himself understood this. He often emphasized that leadership was about service, not power. Victory was meaningless unless it brought justice, equality, and opportunity to the people. And for many, that was the true triumph of the revolution, not the fall of the nationalists, but the rise of a nation that belonged to its people. As the 1950s progressed, China faced new challenges. Consolidating power across such a vast country was never easy. Mao needed to balance modernization with the revolutionary ideals that had won the war. The nation was still poor, and progress was slow. But the spirit of unity and purpose remained strong. Education became a cornerstone of this legacy. Millions of children, once illiterate, learned to read and write. Schools encouraged critical thinking, discipline, and moral values. Teachers emphasized not only knowledge, but also character, the belief that everyone, no matter their origin, could contribute to the nation. Healthcare reached rural villages where doctors traveled long distances to care for the sick. Small hospitals were built, and vaccination campaigns were launched. For the first time, life expectancy began to improve in many regions. The revolution, once seen as an upheaval, was now showing its practical benefits, proof that politics and compassion could work together. Industry and infrastructure continued to grow. Railways stretched across provinces, linking previously isolated communities. Factories produced steel, machinery, and textiles. Electricity reached cities and towns, improving both life and productivity. But these achievements were guided by a single principle. The nation's strength depended on its people. Machines alone could not build China. People could. Mao's moral lessons extended beyond the practical. He often said that unity and discipline are as important as courage in battle. He believed that a country cannot thrive if its citizens fight among themselves or if selfishness dominates. Every policy, campaign, and reform carried this underlying message. China would succeed only if its people acted together, honestly, and with purpose. The revolution also changed social relationships. Women gained rights, children gained education, and ordinary citizens gained a voice. For centuries, China had been ruled by a small elite. Now, the people were not only participants in governance, but also architects of their own future. It was a profound shift, a reminder that equality and opportunity are central to a strong nation. However, history also teaches caution. Mao's methods of enforcing unity were strict. Campaigns against corruption and disloyalty sometimes caused fear. Mistakes were made, and not all policies worked perfectly. The revolution's legacy is therefore a lesson in balance between leadership and freedom, discipline and creativity, ambition and humility. Even so, the moral heart of the revolution endured. It reminded every citizen that sacrifice, service, and integrity matter, that change begins with individuals, grows with communities, and becomes history when nations act together. By the early 1950s, China had been reshaped. The map, the government, and the society were different. But perhaps most importantly, the people themselves had been transformed. They learned that they could rise from suffering, unite despite differences, and create a nation that reflected their own dreams and hopes. Mao's victory over the Nationalists, then, was not just a military event, it was a turning point in human history, a demonstration that ordinary people, when led by vision and purpose, can achieve extraordinary change. The story of the Chinese Communist Revolution leaves a simple but profound lesson for all generations. Freedom, unity, and progress are won not by force alone, but by the courage to dream, the patience to endure, and the moral will to act for the common good. Even decades later, China's rise and transformation trace back to that moment in Tiananmen Square in 1949, a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders, but by the millions of hearts who believe in something greater than themselves. And so, the revolution's legacy is both practical and moral. It teaches us that nations are built not just by power or ambition, but by principles, perseverance, and a courage to give every person a chance to matter. For China, that chance had arrived. For the world, the lesson was clear. Lasting change is born from unity, vision, and the unwavering belief that ordinary people can achieve the extraordinary.
For more journeys into the past and insights that connect history to today, subscribe to our channel and stay curious with us.